Hey, welcome back, everybody. Well, so often we know that female desire is often cast to the side, but our next guest puts it right in the forefront. In her number one New York Times bestselling book, Three Women, Lisa Taddeo profiles three real women and, yes, their sex lives. She's here to talk about it and the fact that the book is also in paperback. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Taddeo, great to have you with us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, Lisa, we read Three Women last year for our book club, and all of us really loved the book. So thank you for writing it, first of all. And thank you for sharing the stories of these three women. And I want to just backtrack because it actually started out by you going and interviewing hundreds of women across the U.S. over a period of 8 years before you settled on these three. And I want to just describe these three women quickly. Lena is one. She's a mother in a passionless marriage. Sloan was another, a happily married woman who lets her husband watch her have sex with other people. And the third person is Maggie, who is a high school student who alleged a sexual relationship with her teacher. So three very different stories, very complicated stories. What made you settle on these three people?
So I spoke to hundreds, as you said. I at the end of the day, it was these three stories choosing to be in the book as much as it was they just were the ones that let me into their lives and bedrooms more than anybody else had. As you can imagine, it's really hard to get anybody to talk about desire, and certainly to say, and this might be in a book in a year or two. So one of the other things that linked the three that I really was so struck by was the amount that they were judged by other people in their communities. And that to me was, these women were judged and yet they did not judge others. And I found that rare.
What also is quite interesting about these three women's stories is that there is such a difference, an array of sexual desires among them. So, for example, Lena, she really loves French kissing. Sloan, as you know, Cynthia had mentioned, she enjoys having sex with other people in front of her husband. And so you really put agency, their sexual agency, front and center, because you say a lot of times people mislabel women as victims. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I think that, well, to start with, I think that calling other women victims is one of the most victimizing things that we can do. What I found with Lena in particular, this woman who has not been kissed in a decade or touched at all, who was raped as a young woman, is finally feeling like herself, like a sexual being in the world, and having sex with this man with whom she's always been obsessed, and she's driving 4 hours to see him for 30 minutes. And so with Lena, I didn't think she was a victim. She was driving all these hours to see this man, but she was doing it with her own agency. She was doing it against her Catholic faith. She was doing it at the cost of money, which she didn't have enough of. And so I didn't see her as a victim at all, but I saw her as a victim of a society that didn't want a woman to have sex with someone she wanted to have sex with.
Your book also really explores this idea about how sex can sometimes be performative, particularly for women, and that women often struggle with this idea of figuring out where their desire begins or ends and their partner's begins, and so on. So did this come up a lot in your research, and or why do you think this is such the case for so many women?
I think that for women, often in the beginning of a relationship, the performative aspect is such a big part, and it's more about the way that the man is seeing them and the way that they sort of exist in the man's gaze. And I think it starts out like that because we are biologically tuned into there not being enough of the male supply. Essentially, we are the ones supposed to be at home with the child, biologically speaking, and the man is supposed to go out and be with many women. So at the beginning, it becomes wanting to keep this person and to make them see that you are the sexiest thing around and to stay with you. And that changes eventually, but I think that's what it becomes at first. I also think that societally, that's what has happened, that we see things on television and in movies, and we feel like if we're not doing that, if we're not holding our hair up and when we're on top of a man in a certain manner, that they aren't going to want to come back.
You already alluded to Judgement, Judgment of Women's Sexual Expression. And you alluded to this, that maybe it is because of supply and demand and scarcity that often that judgment of women's sexual expression is often coming from other women, which is such a huge obstacle to that very expression. Why do you think that is?
I think that what I noticed with my book and readers, and female readers specifically, is that they didn't want to read stories about women who made them feel like a past version of themselves was coming back to haunt them, specifically with Lena's story. And I think that there's also a level of a sort of jealousy involved, that when Lena, for example, was in this discussion group that I'd started in the back of that doctor's office, she came in and talked about her husband not wanting to kiss her on the mouth. And when she did that, everybody crowded around her and hugged her and gave her tissues. And then when she came back in and told the story about how she had reconnected with her former lover, that was when they all sort of didn't want to hear it anymore. So I think that it often jealousy and shame comes in. And that's why we judge one another. And I don't think there's, I think it's often our own, it is 100% always our own stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're talking about this shame and judgment, because it comes up a lot in the book. And it means that living with that kind of shame and judgment, particularly from other women, means that it can be very lonely for women, especially women who try to stray outside of what society has deemed to be, quote unquote, like the normal amounts of desire or normal types of sexual behavior. So why was that such an important point for you to focus on?
One of the things that I think the Me Too movement is obviously vital and fantastic, and we are making so many gigantic advances in the way that women are perceived in the world and the way we perceive ourselves. But that being said, I feel like there's been an inverse issue, which is that we've finally been telling men what we don't want. But with other women, come to us and we don't want to hear what other women want. Women can't want the wrong thing. We can no longer want a man who is not the quote unquote correct man. And some people who have been uncomfortable with the book, I think also have been uncomfortable with hearing about women going like, why would you devote a book to a woman's sex life or to three women's sex life? Why wouldn't it just be a study? Why didn't you also include men? I think we're still uncomfortable with that. We're still living under the hangover of a patriarchal society.
That's a good way to put it. The book has received so much praise, Lisa. And if there's anything that people have brought up, it is maybe the question of representation. In many ways, the three women that you profiled in the book, they do share a racial, a sexual, and somewhat socioeconomic identities here. Was it your intent to, provide a wider representation of female sexuality?
In the end, the first draft of the book had 20 people. Some of them were men. One was a gay male who was in Sloan's community, who I'd actually moved to Sloan's community for, who was also a professional life coach at 18. There was a woman from Dominica who I'd moved to Los Angeles for, who after 6 months of profiling her, hanging out with her, being with her almost every day, met someone no longer wanted to be talked about in the book at all, even under a pseudonym. So I had a lot of roadblocks. I had a lot of people drop out. I am fortunate that these three women are also women that I do feel are representative, not in terms of the window dressing, not in terms of their being white. I don't think that's representative, obviously, of the world. But what they are representative of, what we all are representative of, is the desire to be loved, the passion that comes and the pain that comes from high passion, and the lows that come from highs. And so in that way, I do think they're representative. I think we're all representative. I think the only way to be totally representative is to be completely honest, completely specific.
You mentioned Me Too, and I understand that the majority of your research and your writing and your interviews all took place prior to the Me Too movement. Do you think that any aspects of the book might have changed if you had started it, let's say, today in a post sort of Me Too discussion world?
So I think it's different for all three. For Lena, I would say it wouldn't have been changed at all. Lena, when I spoke to her towards the end of the book, after the Harvey Weinstein story had broken, did not know who Harvey Weinstein was, had not heard of the case. And still to this day, might have heard his name, but is not, I still talk to her. It's not something that's on her radar. For Maggie, whose case, her trial went in a way that was shocking, even though there were all these phone calls between this teacher and her after 11 p.m., midnight. I spoke to people close to the jury, and they all basically said that even if it were true, even if they believed that she had had this relationship with this man, this sexual relationship, that even then they would have acquitted him. And so I don't know if that would have changed, because it's taking longer to reach people in North Dakota, in the middle of the country, in the middle of any country, I'm sorry, not even the middle, but in any place where it's not a big city. We consume media differently. Lena is reading Country Living. She's not reading the New York Times. And there's nothing, we don't know that. We can't really access that, which is why I think there's a lot of problems with politics. We don't want to know the way the rest of the country is, what the rest of the country is doing, basically. If it's not what we're doing, it's other.
Lisa, what a fascinating, eye-opening discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Three Women is now available in paperback. We'll be back after this.